Okay. Welcome, everyone. It is 1 minute past 10, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'm going to start. Hello. Many of you know me. My name is Niamh O'Sullivan. I'm the Manager of Social Enterprise and Networks at BuySocial Canada. Welcome to our webinar today on Introduction to Community Bonds, enabling community ownership of assets. Before we dive in, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we live, work, and learn on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral lands of Indigenous and First Nations peoples. I myself am calling from the Squamish and Lil'wat Nations in BC, also known as the Sea to Sky Corridor. And we are a national organization, and many of you are joining from all across the country. So we invite you to consider what efforts we can all take to repair and improve our relations with Indigenous people, both locally and globally. So I know many of us spend a lot of time on Zoom, but some basic housekeeping as we get going. I ask everyone, other than the speakers, to remain muted throughout the webinar. And at the end, we will hold time for questions. Feel free to use the chat if things come up, but we'll make sure to hold time for questions, lots of time for questions at the end, because this is quite a new topic for many of you. So why are we here today? Why are we hosting this webinar? As many of you know, BuySocial Canada is a social enterprise, and we believe that every purchase or transaction has a social, cultural, environmental, and economic impact, whether people realize it or not. And we believe in leveraging the power of that purchasing for greater good and creating community capital. At our core at BuySocial Canada, we want to create a marketplace revolution, and we can do that using 3 key pieces. The first is with social enterprise, so businesses that sell goods or services that have a social, cultural, environmental purpose, and that they reinvest the majority of their profits back into that purpose or mission. In order for these social enterprises to thrive, they need demand for their goods and services. The more they sell, the more impact they can create. In a thriving marketplace where their goods and services are sold, that's when social procurement really comes into play. So developing policies and frameworks for large purchasers so they can practice social procurement and buy from social enterprise. That's a big piece of the work that we do at BuySocial Canada. Probably 80% of our work is focused on social procurement. But the last piece of the puzzle is social finance. We know that all enterprises need capital to support in the planning phase, the sustaining phase, or the growth phase of a business. Some social enterprises also have a hard time accessing capital, such as loans or credit cards from traditional financial institutions. So then what are the options? Often, because social enterprises have additional social costs, these could be wraparound supports, something that traditional businesses may not offer. They might have a harder time saving enough of a pillow to weather any economic storms or to grow their business or scale for a business opportunity. So what's the solution? What are different ways that social enterprises and nonprofits can access more funding? Today, we're going to focus on the social finance piece of this. We've invited one of our community champions, Tapestry Community Capital, to speak on community bonds. We're going to hear from their knowledge lead, Suzanne Baiza, who will share with us what a community bond is and how it all works. After that, we want to share the perspective from the social enterprise who has been through this whole process. We'll invite Mary Mowbray, who's the co-chair in fundraising from Hughes Room Live, a registered charity nonprofit which focuses on music, arts, and culture. They operate a venue space in downtown Toronto that hosts live music from local musicians. They went through this community bonds process with Tapestry Community Capital in order to purchase a space. And then after Mary speaks, we'll have maybe half an hour, loads of time for questions, as I know it's a new topic. And if you're in any way similar to me, there'll be lots of questions. So now, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Suzanne.
Hi, Niamh. Thank you. And everyone here, thank you so much for being here. Many thanks to the BuySocial Canada team for hosting this and for the warm introduction. And thanks to you all for joining us. There's a lot to cover today, so I am going to just jump straight in and share some slides. Hold on for a minute. Apologies. You are all looking at my screen, which will be up soon. Amazing. Yay. So as I said, there's a lot to cover today, so I'll just jump straight in. So first and foremost, who is Tapestry Community Capital? As Neve mentioned, I am Suzanne, I'm their knowledge lead, but essentially we are a nonprofit cooperative whose mission is to democratize access to capital through the use of community investment tools. And what we do is that we help guide organizations to successfully plan, raise, and administer community investment and community finance. But that kind of begs a broader question of what on earth is social and community finance? You will hear these terms many times, but what do they fundamentally mean? So to me, social finance is a broader umbrella term. It in essence combines both tools and philosophies about these tools that fundamentally are about combining financial and social, cultural, and or environmental returns. So they're all kind of valued equally, and sometimes, the social and financial and cultural are even more so. Community finance is then just a subset of social finance. It involves local engagement and participation and focuses on the flow and circulation of capital within communities. There are quite a few tools here used in community finance, as seen on the slide, preference shares, etc., community loan funds, community-driven outcomes contracts, etc. But the one we're going to focus on today is the one that Tapestry deals with the most, which are community bonds. So what on earth is a community bond? Let's get that clear. Very simply, they are a loan. So by issuing bonds, community organizations borrow money from their community of supporters for, say, a particular face value, particular term, and a rate. So think $500 for 2 years at 3.5% rate. Oh, I apologize for that very loud email notification. And then community bonds, though, are also a private exempt market security. So by private, this means that you won't find them on the Toronto Montreal Stock Exchange. And by exempt, it means that community bonds don't need administratively burdensome prospectuses to be issued because, once again, they're not on the public market. So if it's very simply a loan, why a community bond? Like, what are the key value adds here? For me, I'm going to talk about four because we have a limited number of time. First is the flexibility. So community bonds prioritize as with the social and community finance piece, social, cultural, and environmental returns alongside financial ones. And this means what we are doing here, and the key part here is that organizations can set their own terms, their own interest rates, their repayment terms, and the maturity to align with project milestones and cash flow needs. This provides more equitable and accessible financing that fully recognizes the value of organizations' work. Second, it's inclusive. So bonds can have both retail and institutional investors. So retail investors are people like you and me who are not high net worth, but have money that we can maybe put towards, we can donate, and then, yes, we can also invest in organizations. The interest paid out here is paid out to community supporters and thus enabling some type of community wealth building. They're also timely, so typically they require about a third of the time of a traditional donation campaign, and unlike government grants, can be planned to meet organizations' cash flow needs, and they're also scalable. With many investors reinvesting, what we've seen is that there's a great opportunity to develop future projects and keep investors engaged. So, for example, one of our clients and one of our oldest clients, SolarShare, which is North America's largest solar renewable energy co-op, has run multiple bond campaigns with Tapestry, going from a few $100,000 to over in at one point in the last couple of years to over $10 million in raises. So with all that said, are there risks? Yes, all investments and all loans have risk. So let's in particular evaluate some of them for community bonds. So the first one I want to talk about is default risk. So here your organization is unable to repay your investors both their principal and their interest. That is a risk. There's also liquidity risk. So say if your bonds are asset backed, and they can be, it's not required, but you could do it if you'd like to, and you're unable to repay your investors, you may need to sell properties or equipment to repay your investors. Um, There's also investor interest, which is, interest rates may rise or fall, which could mean that at a certain point, maybe your bonds are not as competitive. A few years ago, bonds were giving interest rates competitive to that of GICs. Currently, what we're seeing is that no, it isn't as quote unquote equivalent to GIC rates, but what we're seeing is that because of the community aspect, the social aspect, the environmental aspect, more and more people are committing to actually investing within their communities. And last but not least is a resources risk. So for us, and I think it's important to say it, is the first community bond campaign entails building internal processes and infrastructure and, your investor base and learning to execute community bonds well. There is a learning curve here. This requires time, resources, both human and financial, and organizational attention. Your first raise is across all of those metrics likely to be your costliest raise. And then as you continue to do them over and over, the cost of that goes down. And as seen on the slide here, there are also some mitigation strategies for each of these risks that I've spoken about. So how does Tapestry help? How do we interface with social purpose organizations raising capital? So we provide end-to-end support defined by 4 key phases. So first is planning and feasibility. Here we're determining whether or not taking on debt is feasible. Because you know what? For some organizations, debt is not taking on debt, even community of capital is not feasible. And we need to know that answer sooner rather than later. So here we do financial modeling, investor consultations, and stuff like that in order to actually build up your terms. And then we structure those terms. So putting together offering memorandums, trustee agreements, legal reviews, and making sure that everything is crisp for your investors who are your community. You want to communicate with them well. And then the third part of this phase, not the last one, is supporting the raise. So we can't directly sell the bonds for organizations. We are not an exempt market dealer. But what we do is that we help organizations to put together their marketing strategy and plan, and we help them be in touch with PR consultants who can help them get their messaging and word out there. Um, and last but not least is managing. So we do the T5s, interest disbursements, and filings, etc., for organizations because that is a significant administrative burden that we take off of your hands for a certain fee. And of course, as I just mentioned, all of the support comes with a price tag, which we do our best to help support organizations with paying. We are a nonprofit ourselves, and we do try and figure out how we can help use grants and other things to help or help build the cost of it into the raise itself in order to help cover these costs. We're doing our best to not be part of the nonprofit industrial complex. And I guess from here, the next question is for community-based organizations, what are some of the key things that you want to consider taking all of this, the value adds, the risk in Tapestry's process? I'm going to go over for you here, but they're all important to consider. So first is like a sporadic raise versus, or like a single time raise or versus multiple raises. Do you need to build community bond infrastructure for your organization? Maybe you do actually want to do that community engagement and yeah, it requires trust and working at the pace of trust, especially for that first bond raise. But yeah, you do need to decide, is this something that you want? And then what projects do you need financing for? And is debt necessarily the answer for it? How does your board feel about community finance? Do they understand it? Do they understand what the risks are, etc.? What does your internal capacity look like? Maybe you have staff, but maybe they're overwhelmed. Or maybe you have a complete board of volunteers, which we've seen before, but because they're retired, they have so much time on their hands, they can go out and do the sale. So, there are things like that to consider as well. Do you have a sustainable revenue model or a viable business case in order to take on a community bond? And when do you need the money by? Are your timelines for this reasonable? We like my growth and impact associate colleague who fundamentally runs our business development likes to give like a 9 to 12 month period here around the capital raise. And We tackle all of this in our discovery calls and planning and feasibility, so that way these questions are answered way ahead of time. And our assessment criteria then is very similar. We are looking for meaningful projects when working with folks with a social and environmental impact. We're looking at what your organization is, like your board and staff. We've worked with quite a few organizations. We've actually built up a thing of, yeah, we feel these folks can take it on. We feel these folks can't. And then we actually communicate that to you. We assess your internal capacity, et cetera, to support a community bond campaign. We determine, is there a sustainable revenue model? And while it's not on the slide, a viable business case. Do you have realistic timelines, as I mentioned before? And the raise target here, like to work with us and make it like financially viable for you to work with us, we're looking for generally raises that are at minimum 500,000 to more. And especially as we're working in social purpose real estate and affordable housing, these numbers are getting higher and higher in terms of the raise amounts. And that the funds are generally used for capital assets and major equipment. So Solar Share doesn't have buildings per se. What they have are renewable energy installations and like solar energy infrastructures. And that's actually, so they do have asset-backed bonds, but that was actually tied to the infrastructure in place, which I thought is super cool. So with all of that, and these are my last few slides, folks, apologies for the information dump. Have community bonds been used in Canada? Absolutely. So over the last 20 odd years, 33 plus social purpose organizations have issued community bonds raising about 130 million, and have financed, and actually we're over the 130 million mark now, with some of our housing organizations, and have financed renewable energy, arts, food security, housing, and community hubs. And as seen next, considering just Tapestry supported clients, these bonds have kickstarted 62 projects, created a little over 3,000 community investors, both retail and institutional, and has returned about 17 million in interest to community-based investors. So thank you all for your time. And now I'm going to get to the really interesting part of our presentation, which is actually handing it over to our lovely client, Hughes Room Live, and Mary Mowbray is their representative, who are showcasing how community bonds are used to secure ever scarce art spaces in Toronto. So there is one thing that I will need to do, and that is to stop sharing my screen and help load Mary's slides, which I have just received. So I am going to do that, and then Mary, I will hand it off to you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Sorry about that. Can people hear me can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm trying to turn my audio on. I think I turned my video off, but I think it's on now. And that's my fault that Suzanne's having to load that now because I just got it to her before. But I'll just start to talk a little bit. So my name is Mary Mowbray, and I co-chair the fundraising for Hughes Room Live. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Hughes Room Live. If you flip just to the third one, Suzanne, the next one, yeah, I'll just talk a little bit. So if for those of you who aren't in Toronto and haven't heard of it, Hughes Room Live is a music venue in Toronto that's operated for about 20 years, and it's an intimate venue. We seat about 200 people. It started off as kind of a folk roots place. That's a picture of Judy Collins. There are lots of incredibly well-known Canadian artists who have played there, and it basically functions, I would say, as a stage for emerging artists, and then kind of a homecoming place for really successful artists as well. We had Jim Cuddy just did his most recent album launch there, and you can listen to any kind of music, anything from jazz, blues, roots, folk, lots of singer-songwriters. So it's a really incredible place, but it fosters this really cool, potential interactions between the musicians and the audience because you're so close to them. You can go up and talk to most of them afterwards. So it's a really cool spot. Unfortunately, we were forced out of our previous location because of rising rents, and so the classic tale of gentrification. And the business had been started. It wasn't. Oh, sorry about that. sorry, thought I'd muted my phone. The business was started, and it was a business. It's now a registered nonprofit, but it was started by a fellow in, it was named after his brother who had died quite young of cancer. And a number of years ago, about 6 or 7 years ago, it was failing as a business, and it's a very tough business to be in. Ticket sales don't cover your costs. They had a food and bar model, and a number of really passionate volunteers stepped in and took it over and converted it into a registered nonprofit. So it's a registered charity now. And then they looked for a permanent home. And we were able to find a building last summer. We looked at it for a couple of years, but we were able to find a building last summer that we bought. It's a former church, and it's amazing. It's got great acoustics. And by buying the building, we can ensure that Hughes Room Live has a sustainable future for many, many years to come. Now, the way we bought the building, if you flip to, if you flip to the next one, this is the building that we bought. We're going to do probably close to 200 shows a year, 200 shows this year in it. We do sellout shows all the time. And we also rent it out for other organizations, so they can utilize it. But it's our goal is to turn it really into a music hub. We don't really use the lower level really at all. We just mostly use the main level. And if you flip to the next slide, I'll just tell you how we've grown as an organization since buying the building. It's become such a great focus. We have a really robust business model. So we generate money from our show revenue. We have rentals. We have a bar in there. We also have some sponsorships. We have some grants we've received. We actually have a team that volunteers at a bingo hall, and we get charitable donations from the bingo operator. And then because we're a charitable organization, we also get straight donations. So we have a really diverse and robust revenue stream. And quite a few volunteers. However, when we bought the building, we had to take on debt to do that. And we took on a number of mortgages that we're looking to clear. So our story is actually a little bit different. If you flip to the next slide, I'll just talk to you a little bit about the financing and what we wanted to do. So we bought the building last year for about $4 million, and we did a combination of financing pieces. We had a VTB from the vendor for about $500,000, which we have to pay off by next summer. We also had a private investor who gave us a mortgage for $1.3 million that's due this fall, and he would not extend it. And then we also had, I think we have another mortgage with a church. So we had to put stuff together, and then we got a fair bit of money in donations, but we also actually did a community bond campaign. So we're a little bit different than probably most organizations, and I'll explain it on the next slide, in that we ran this, what I would call kind of a holistic family and friends bond campaign. I'd say the only reason we were able to do it is because our chair happens to know about Tapestry and is is he still on the board, or he was on the board of Tapestry, Brian Eiler? I can't remember if he's still on it or not. But Brian Eiler is a social activist in Toronto who has been involved in numerous things, from music to tons of environmental groups. And so when we needed to raise money last year to buy the building, the organization launched a family and friends bond campaign, but not, I wouldn't call it really an official campaign. And so the way we were able to do that was because, frankly, Brian knew about community bonds because of his relationship with Tapestry. And not only did he know about them, but he had a high degree of familiarity with them, and he was very comfortable with them. The other piece about it that made it work, and so I'd say it would generally, I wouldn't recommend this type of strategy, and I would not think it would work, is Brian had great confidence in his personal network. And this is what I mean by that. We raised $1.3 million, and many of them are $100,000 bonds. So Brian basically called his personal network and said, would you invest in Hughes Room Live? It's a 5-year bond. Here's your return. You'll be in whatever position on title. Not a strategy that I would generally say, you would follow. And then the last piece of it is that Brian happens to be a lawyer. So he actually used his law firm's trust account. He was able to do a whole lot of things that most organizations couldn't do. But the bottom line is we had this kind of organic, holistic process that you know, he basically did by himself, and we were able to raise $1.3 million. This year, we have to pay off this coincidentally other $1.3 million mortgage. And if you go to the next slide, that's what I want to talk to you about in more detail. We actually launched, you know, this is the official version of Hughes Bonds. And so I think the thing that's kind of interesting here is sort of why did we decide to do bonds? Because we are a registered charity and we can raise money, and we were, you know, looking to raise money, and we do have a campaign, but our resources are such that our focus is really 100% on the bond campaign. So, you know, essentially the organization looked at it and we saw, first of all, that they'd had great success with this campaign without any support, without any real structure, without a marketing campaign to go along with it, just really using one person's knowledge of the tool of community bonds and his personal relationships and his professional, you know, infrastructure. So I think there was you know, that success gave the organization a lot of confidence. The second piece was, I don't think that the time frame appeared realistic for a fundraising campaign. You know, there are a lot of you know, in that sphere in Toronto, you're competing with lots of other organizations. There's some big cultural venues that have just gone through huge fundraising campaigns. We have a big mailing list, but there are, you know, there are people that come to a show and spend $30 or $40 on a ticket. We didn't see that we had inroads into some major donors. And so I think the thinking was that it wouldn't be possible to raise $1.3 million in, you know, back when we decided to do the bond campaign, say 3 or 4 months ago, it would not be possible to do it by September 30th. The other thing was the capacity of the organization. We have a staff of 2, and we have a board of about 7 or 8, and we say we have 50 volunteers, but I'd say realistically we have like a committed 6 kind of thing, or 10. Like it's a small number that are really there. So I don't think that the capacity of the organization was seen to be enough that we could, you know, sort of mobilize and do a fundraising campaign. I mentioned that we have this mailing list. We have a mailing list of over 15,000 people. And the thinking among a number of people who are familiar with bond campaigns was that that was the golden ticket. That we had this mailing list, and that bonds are such a neat idea. You get to invest, maybe your return's a bit lower than it would be in a pure investment vehicle, but you get to support live music, or, you know, something that you're passionate about and contribute to the community. And so I think the thinking was that the mailing list would be the key. I think the perception about risk was that it was a pretty low risk investment for people to be offered, because we were going to be putting these bondholders in first position. So the bond campaign we're doing now, these bondholders will actually be in a prior position to the existing bondholders we already have on title, because we're going to swap one mortgage out and put these in place. And then I guess the last piece in terms of our decision to go ahead was just Tapestry, is that we, you know, I don't think the rest of us were familiar with what Tapestry could do, but Brian understood what it could do. And in our first meetings, it was clear that they have they've done it before, and they have a whole plan, and they lay it out. And you know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel or come up with ideas of what to do. You can certainly add to the process, but there is a very, very fulsome process in place. And I think that was very comforting. So that brings me to the next slide, which I think is, I'm just going to flip through these because I cannot not mention this in case someone on the phone is passionate about live music and supporting emerging artists and small venues and giving back to the community. I'll just say in 30 seconds, our bond sales start at $1,000. You get a 3% annual interest rate, 5-year term. The next increment is 5,000. That's 3.5% up to 25 at 4. And there's no cap. If you wanted to invest 100,000, we would certainly welcome that. 5-year mortgage. And it's secured, as I said, by a first mortgage on a building that we spent $4 million on last summer. And we're only raising $1.3 million for this. So I'd say it's fairly low risk. The next slide is, I believe, related to the bond piece again. Yeah, so we can flip by this one. I've already covered it all, just in terms of what a great investment it is. So where are we now? We're selling bonds. And so this is the part where I wanted to sort of share what we've learned from it. So the first thing I would say is that I mean, I certainly have a far better understanding of the resources that are required by the organization. I think we were quite naive, and I'm saying we in this sort of royal sense, we were quite naive in thinking that our mailing list would be, would be, you know, it's important to have that, if you, because you have people to go to, but the idea that you're just going to take this to them and that people are just going to immediately think they're on board with it was not realistic. So I think understanding, that was an eye opener. And you might be here listening to me and going, well, of course, that's kind of obvious. But I think there were people who really did think that was important. Like someone actually explained it to me when I said, how does this compete with our fundraising? They said it's totally different. This will just send out to our 15,000 people. We'll use Tapestry for all the back of house stuff. They'll tell us what to do, and then we'll send it out to our mailing list, and we'll sell the bonds, and it'll be easy. That I don't think that's how it works. There's work to do, and you need to really promote it. You need to promote it everywhere. If you have opportunities to get in front of potential donors, and we do and did, I think it's a huge advantage, but you have to be able to articulate your message, and you have to create content to support it. The next thing is leadership. You know, I think you need someone who can drive it. And in a lot of you might think, well, that's kind of obvious, but you need, we have a fellow who's organizing it, but his time is limited, and he's more of a coordinator. So you need someone who's kind of on the campaign and is looking at it all the time, and where are you, and what do you need to be tweaking, and what are you not doing? But you really need somebody, or maybe it's two people in the organization, who are going to champion it and take responsibility for it. The next thing I'd say that's really important is you need a team of volunteers. And part of that is for the actual work. And if you didn't have this, you could outsource it. But for instance, you need to create content. If you're going to try to support it with social media or even emails, you need people to create the content for that, because you can't be sending the same thing out all the time. You may want different graphics. You may want different, slightly, like, tweaking the messaging all the time. And this, again, would depend on the length of your campaign. So you could pay someone to do that, but a lot of organizations may not, have the ability to do that. So you need volunteers who can be doing that. But you also, I think, want volunteers to increase your reach. I think that's an important piece. You want your volunteers to look to engage their networks as well. And it's kind of covered by what I've said, but it's not on here. But I think the timing is also important. Like, you can probably, we're trying to run a really compressed bond campaign over the summer, and it's really hard. And so I would say, look at the timeframes of previous campaigns and take them seriously. You do need time to do your setup. If you're going to be doing weekly updates, you have to have them ready to go. So the time is really important in it. And then the last thing I'd say is that Tapestry has a process. I mean, they gave us a whole plan and said, this is what you need to be doing. They gave us a communication calendar. So if you're going to do it, you need to follow the process, and if you're to have the greatest chance of success. And maybe you could be successful, maybe we can be successful without always doing that. But to me, that's one of the biggest pieces. There is learning as you go as well. You have to learn how to use some of the tools that are on the back end. They're not super complicated. It's not the end of the world, but actually doing the promotion and the marketing and the talking to people and the follow-up, you have to be doing that. And I think that really wraps it up for what I wanted to talk about. I think there's probably one last slide that says, how do you buy a bond? Just because I had to include it. But that's it. So I hope that's been helpful.
That was brilliant. Oh, thank you so much, Mary, and thank you so much, Suzanne. It was, well, I've obviously been very connected with Tapestry Community Capital over the past year, but it's so interesting to hear the perspective of the social enterprise that's gone through the process, and to have frank conversations of what's been successful and what's been more challenging, because that's why we're hosting this webinar, and that's what people want to hear. So thank you both. A couple of questions came up there. Bob Prenavost asked, for social purpose real estate projects, such as mixed use projects, which include affordable housing and community spaces, where do community bonds fit within the capital stack? And Bob,
Sorry.
Bob is put on his camera, and you can unmute yourself as well, Bob, if you want to chat.
I mean, I can take a first stab at answering that. I mean, I have an answer for it, but it really does depend upon your capital stack. So, for example, both Hughes Room Live and like one of our other issues, Places for People, who's a rural housing provider in Halberton County here in Ontario, used community bonds exclusively. So, like, Places for People used community bonds to replace some of their existing mortgages in the same way that, like, Hughes Room Live is. And so they've essentially used community bonds as 100% of the capital stack. For other folks, it's actually a part of the capital stack. So it's usually a subordinate to, say, a traditional mortgage. So yeah, like it can be also in like second or third place, depending. There's a graphic that I almost wish I had to show you, but I don't have it right now. But one of our issuers, Sketch Working Arts, who is another arts organization here in Toronto, who actually went through the entire process of using a community bond to actually buy out their current space so that way they weren't paying rent anymore, actually went through the entire process of having vendor take back mortgages and then replaced it with alternate capital that then had community bonds replace it. So you could actually see how community bonds stacked in different times. And so at one point, community bonds were like in third place, and then at one point, community bonds were in first place. So yeah, like that can also change over time. So that I think is usually an interesting, and usually for social purpose real estate projects, that's where it will be taking place, because you have large value sums that you need to make up for. But community bonds can act as catalytic capital to get other capital. I mean, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up to that, if I may. Have you had any instances with social purpose real estate projects, particularly where there's a mixed use, where you have affordable housing and perhaps like a community organization, also occupying the space as well, or part of the building, where they've used a community bond to potentially raise some of the pre-development financing, like it's been early capital as opposed to late capital?
So one of our issuers, Indwell here in Southern Ontario, is actually a supportive housing provider. So they aren't the profile that you've said, but what they are doing is that they're raising $5 million for a revolving loan fund to do their pre-development costs, so they can actually get more of their projects online. Like Indwell has $250 million in equity, so they have like plenty of assets, but what they're using that community bond for is essentially they need to get more projects online and make sure that they're in construction as opposed to pre-development and being stuck in pre-development hell. Sorry, but that is a literal phase of
To my world.
well, I used to be an architect, and I remember what that used to be like, of having projects stuck because there wasn't enough capital. And so Indwell, as a supportive housing provider, and just the need to reduce poverty, needs to get more of this, and so that's what they're using it for. They're currently raised about 3.7 million out of their out of their 5 right now. So they're chugging along on that. But yes, we are seeing that kind of use, and especially as a revolving loan fund, because they expect to be able to use CMHC capital to buy it out anyway. So
Yeah,
they know that that's their viable business case and business model for actually repaying investors.
great. I don't want to dominate this, but I would appreciate maybe offline if you could send me some information about this, because
Yeah.
most of our clients are nonprofit organizations, and this is one of the sort of key sticking points in projects, is getting through the early stage pre-development, and we need access to capital to do that. Like, we just can't depend on government for this. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
I've
Bob.
put my email in the chat, so you're welcome to email me, and then I can send you information.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Thanks so much, Bob. Mary from OCBN, you put in, a question. What is the timeline to prep and raise a community bond? Is that still your question, or did you want to ask something else? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Sorry, it took me a while. The screen went to the back. I can hear you guys, but it take once to bring it up. Yeah, that's still my question. The time to prep and the actual race, and also I'm interested in the cost of to get Tapestry help in terms of prep and the race. Just ballpark is fine.
Yeah. Okay. So I can definitely help on the timelines. Costs is sometimes a little bit tricky. Kind of wish I could download my business development colleagues' information into my brain this very minute, but I will do my best to answer. So in terms of timeline, that imagine like planning and feasibility, we usually put about 2 to 3 months, depending on an organization's current information that they already have. Like, for example, like some of our really large housing providers, they already have a pro forma. They just, so when we were doing the financial modeling, it's like easy peasy for them. For some of our other organizations, they actually require a little more hand holding. So like Indwell took maybe a month and a half. Some organizations take 3. So keep that in mind about that. And then structuring is a significantly shorter process. We usually take about 1 to 2 months on that. And 1.5 being like a more clear number. So that's 3, 5, and then the raise really depends. And we usually say about like 6, like 5, like 5 months. So that's about a year to actually do the entire thing from like planning and feasibility to raise. And of course, this really depends on like an organization and like what kind of resources they have and what kind of implementations that they actually have in terms of like raising the capital, etc. One of our issuers, Places for People that I mentioned earlier, raised $850,000 in 2.5 months. Keep in mind, there are a bunch of they're a group of lovely old retired folks who had plenty of time and were like, we need the money, and they did it in 2.5 months in the summer last year, and that was really beautiful to see. And they went out to their community, 72 investors, and got that money in. Some organizations take a little bit longer, and that's okay as well. In terms of cost, so management costs, so that's at the very end, is about like $5,000 a year is what I remember Kyle saying at one point. And then the planning to raise part is actually dependent on how much of our services you use. So what we figured out a few years ago is that actually doing like a percentage of the raise was never either too much, charging organizations too much, or charging them too little for our services. So we actually have like a custom menu of services that we try and take people through and be like, what will you actually need? And that's why we do all of that assessment. So it's usually some sort of percentage of the raise, around 1 to 2%, but that's a very ballpark value. Yeah, that's what I can tell you in terms of the costs. And once again, I'm not Kyle. I wish I was in this moment, because he would give you much better and much more concrete answers than I can on this. So if you actually want to know more, please email Kyle at tapestrycapital.ca. He's our growth and impact associate, and he leads all of our business development.
Perfect. Thanks, Mary. Hope that answers your question. Next, Brianna Flynn from First Light asked, who is actually issuing the interest payments each year? Is that facilitated by the organization?
Sorry, could you repeat that question again?
Who is actually issuing the interest payments each year? And is that facilitated by the organization? Brianna, did you mean, is this facilitated by First Light, like your organization as the example, or do you mean the organization being Tapestry Community Capital?
Yeah, I mean, for Slides, like, would we, as the organization, be responsible for issuing? Like, who's facilitating that part of the process?
Oh, right. Okay, so that comes under management. So what we do is that we actually send out the T5s and the interest payment disbursements on on your behalf. Like there is some like open banking stuff that does take place, but it's a secure system with Zoom rails, etc., that enables you to not have that in-house. It goes through technically not even us. It goes through Zoom rails. So it's like from the issuer to the investor directly. We actually don't hold the funds.
Interesting. That answer your question, Brianna? Oh yeah, thumbs up.
Yes, thank you.
Colin, when raising funds, do you find different strategies are needed to reach different potential bond purchasers? And is it different speaking to someone who might invest $1,000 compared to someone who might invest $100,000? That's a good question.
Yeah.
No, I think I'm going to let Mary answer this one first, and then I have also some thoughts. But I think Mary, like,
Sure.
this is a question for you.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you could find that someone comes to you to buy a bond for 1,000 and they come to buy a bond for 100,000 and they heard about it the same way. So you may find you actually found they came to you the same way. But I think if you were targeting larger bond holders, you would definitely have to have some different strategies. You'd have to have one of a couple of things. You'd either already have to, if your organization would already have to have some relationship with people with that capacity, or you'd have to have identifiable pools of people you could go out to. I mean, the reality is most of the people buying these bonds either already have a connection or have an affinity for what the organization's doing. You're not doing it because you're getting the highest return. And so if you think about it, it's like fundraising. Can you go out with a campaign and get $1 million donor? Sure, you could. You're much more likely to get $1 million donor from someone who's given $5,000 for 10 years. That like traditionally, that's what you would see. So I would say that if you were trying to get larger donors, you'd have to have a more personalized strategy. You'd have to have people who had more of an ability you'd have to have access to those people. And the last piece of that question, do you speak differently? Sort of yes and no. I think ultimately at $100,000, it's a different investment decision. It's definitely a different investment decision than $1,000. And we found that there are lots of people who are doing $1,000 because it makes them feel good. They're not donating the money. They know they're going to get the money back in 5 years and they're going to get interest on it. But it's like they have the money to do that. And I don't think it's the same decision as the big donors, like 100,000. So I think the conversations and the scrutiny are probably a little bit more. We're a little teeny bit different only in that it's a first mortgage. You can't get any more secure on a piece of real estate. And so as long as the value of the first mortgage is realistic compared to the value of the property, like it's proportional and ours is, then that's the risk. We have all, like Suzanne talked about, all the pro forma and all that kind of stuff. We have all those things. Our business model carries our existing financing, but the interest we pay right now prevents us from doing a whole lot of other stuff. And we actually just have to pay this mortgage off. So someone who's worried about risk, our model would actually be, our situation is fairly low risk. So I think the $100,000 donor usually looks at that a little bit more. I think they look at risk differently.
Colin, anything to follow up, or can we pass over to Suzanne? She has anything to add?
That was excellent. Thank you.
Welcome.
I don't have much more to add beyond that, so I will leave Mary's answer as it is.
So, that's it for the questions in the chat. Does anyone else have another pressing question? Please put your hand up.
Can I add one? Can I add one comment that I find kind of interesting? Just I work in commercial real estate, so I'm surrounded by real estate all the time, and I've done fundraising for other organizations, and I always, one of the things I find about the community bonds and about fundraising in general is the simpler you can keep your message, usually the more effective it is. And sometimes organizations struggle with that because they especially when you're sort of deep in an organization, like you sort of, you know what you do, but sometimes it's like, you know, how do you synthesize that? How do you say, I used to be on the board of the Canadian Women's Foundation, and people, people would say, it's really hard to say what we do. Well, actually it wasn't. You could simply say we're a national united way for women and girls, right? You could say that. People understand the United Way. They fund, but they don't administer, they don't run programs. Or you could say we're Canada's National Foundation for Women and Girls, and we fund programs for violence prevention, economic development, and girls' resiliency. Like that's, I don't know, 15 seconds. But at the time, most people in the organization said it's really hard to explain to donors what we do. One of the things I find about the bonds really interesting is they're still relatively new. And I don't think I realized that because we had done this sort of holistic program with basically one guy going to his contacts, which is kind of funny. So when I heard about community bonds, I was like, okay, so I get it. And then listening to people explain them, they made them more complicated. And so to me, a community bond, it's like a corporate bond or a government bond. You lend us some money, we give you interest every year, we pay you back when the bond matures, and it's secured by something. In our case, it's secured by the real estate. But it's actually a really cool concept, and people, it's kind of a plug for Tapestry, but a lot of people get super excited about this concept. They love it. Like the number of people have come up to me after a show and said, that idea is so amazing, because they haven't heard of it before. And this idea, it's so simple, like Canada's bond. People understand that corporate bonds, provincial, everyone gets those things, right? So suddenly it's like, yeah, that's so cool. So it's actually a very simple concept. And it has a lot of appeal, I think, for people. So if you're thinking about it, I would urge you to look into it if it's something that makes sense, because it is something that when you, if it fits with what you're trying to do in your organization, and you can minimize what the risk piece is, it's really enticing. It still takes work to do it, by the way. It still takes you, but the idea, people love the idea about it.
Yeah,
Hopefully
like
it's not as much work for people actually to give the money though. It's all set up. Emma put in a question in the chat, and then we'll go to Colin. Emma's curious to know if Tapestry recommends $1,000 as the lowest bond option, or if you've seen significantly lower options that are more accessible to community.
we don't actually recommend bond terms to organizations. They set them and then also do investor consultations with folks. I mean, I guess we could. I guess our campaigns team could, but generally we let that be a bit of a participatory process around what can the bond terms be. We have seen lower options like 500 currently, and because of, as I mentioned, that electronic transfer, the ETF process that is in hand, 500 is as low as we can administratively go without causing burdens on the issuer. So that's like the only thing there. We're currently working on that. So one thing I haven't mentioned is that we're part of CMHC's housing supply challenges, both round 2 and now round 5. And some of that money from round 2 is actually going into redeveloping the platform piece. Like I talked about the management phase, and there's a platform behind it, a custom platform that we've actually, a white label platform called Atticus. We've been using it for the last 5 to 10 years. And we're now finding that we want to improve what it is. And that's part of the conversation that's going in there, is like, especially one that I'm trying to push, is like, can we do 250? Can we do $100 bonds? Because that, to me, I think will actually get to a place where we are really broadening access, that democratizing access to capital bit that I talked about in the first one. That will be where we actually get there. And it's a process, because we are seeing also that people are interested in investing, as Mary mentioned earlier. It's a really neat idea, and we've even seen with like one of our clients, Propolis Housing Cooperative out in Kamloops, actually had a 16-year-old invest, and the reason why this 16-year-old invested $1,000 into Propolis's lowest bond series is because he wanted to not have the world be as dystopian as it is. And that tells you a lot about his risk aversion. Like I think a lot about that, especially being from BC myself, is like, what has this person seen over the last 16 years of their life that actually makes them be like, oh no, the world is on fire, I need to invest, and this is one of these avenues to do so. And that's part of the conversation around that we have with $1,000 investors versus $100,000 investors, is like, what is your risk aversion? Are you willing to put your money into these local community initiatives that, yes, keep the arts alive because we need the arts, etc. Sorry, I'm going off, and I know that there are other folks who want to talk.
Yes, Suzanne. I love your fire and passion. It's brilliant. Okay, Colin, last question. We have a couple minutes left.
Okay, I hope it's a good one. We've been mostly talking about individuals investing. I saw recently that East Ontario United Way, I believe, made a $100,000 community bond investment into a community land trust. And I wondered if you could speak to where opportunities might be for institutions and community organizations to get involved in community bond campaigns.
Plenty. We encourage foundations and institutional investors to actually invest in community bonds. We have, for the very first time, seen a pension fund invest in a client. Cannot tell you which one, cannot tell you which client either, but there has been that. Foundations have historically invested in community bonds, and like, for me, one of the things that I will be working on as part of the awareness bit is like, where do labor pension funds sit in half of this stuff? There is so much critical work there that, and awareness building, especially around that. So labor pension funds, university endowments, these are the crucial places that we need to unlock. And that's like relationship building and awareness building. And so like things that we're working on, foundations are natural allies. Many foundations have invested in community bonds, like, for example, Sketchworking Arts invested in, had investment from like, oh my gosh, I forget their name, but they're a big Toronto foundation whose name I cannot remember because they do all the art stuff. Oh no, cannot remember them, but they are there. Oh wait,
Slate?
Inspirit. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you, Kylie. Inspirit Foundation has done that. And they even talk about it. So yeah, like there is plenty of room for foundational investment and institutional investment, especially as we were talking about social purpose real estate and affordable housing. And that's where we're seeing some of the stuff come in.
Thank you. Okay, well, this has been incredible. We are pretty much at time. Thank you so much, Tapestry Community Capital, for sharing all your expertise and knowledge.
That's
Thank
great.
you. Thank you so much, Mary, for sharing your perspective and the process that you went through during your entire raise. I encourage everyone to not end these conversations here, but to reach out to us, to Tapestry, and continue learning more about all of this work. But other than that, I wish you all a wonderful day. I hope it's not too hot or humid wherever you are. Enjoy the sunshine if you can. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.